They say every Gilded Age dynasty kept at least one secret ledger, one book meant not to balance but to bury. I thought that was just an old historian's superstition, until the night I opened the Livingston archive and found a column of numbers pointing to a man who wasn't supposed to exist. A name whispered in ink, erased in every genealogy, yet paid for in acres, taxes, and silence. And if you stay with me, you'll understand why this discovery didn't just rewrite a family tree. It threatened an entire dynasty. I was sitting inside the dim records room of the Hudson Historical Society when it happened, the moment the past stopped behaving. The ledgers from 1873 lay before me, the thick leather-bound volumes that controlled the pulse of the Livingston estates during the height of the Gilded Age. These weren't glamorous documents. They were the bones of a fortune: tenant payments, land yields, surveyor notes, valuations of orchards, mills, and forgotten riverfront plots. They should have been ordinary, predictable, perfectly balanced, but they weren't. The numbers refused to settle. Even adjusting for inflation, tenant turnover, and agricultural shifts, the estate's income streams were too large for the acknowledged lineage. And then I saw it, small, almost embarrassed to exist, tucked into the bottom margin of a land registry page. L. Livingston, parcel 14B, eastern boundary. A designation that matched no recorded heir, no baptismal entry, no obituary, no public notice. In any New York paper from the era, whoever this L. Livingston was, the estate had paid taxes on his land for nearly a decade. And then, abruptly, the trail went dark. Witnesses had spoken of a quiet dispute in the early 1880s. A house servant mentioned a carriage that arrived at dawn and left before sunrise. A tenant farmer swore that he once saw an unfamiliar young man escorted into the manor by two senior family stewards, but the statement vanished from county archives, replaced by a single sentence: record corrected for clerical error. Letters from that same year were burned. One estate secretary admitted it decades later in a dying confession. A transfer of funds labeled internal arrangement moved through a Manhattan bank connected to two newspapers known for killing stories before they reached print. Every dynasty in the Gilded Age manipulated its own mythology. But the Livingstons, they perfected it. They erased heirs, rearranged marriages, concealed scandals with polished obituaries and philanthropic distractions. Which means, if an entire branch was deliberately removed from the record, the reason was never small. Have you ever heard a story like this hidden inside a Gilded Age mansion? Because what I'm about to show you is the kind of truth the elite tried to erase. And this channel exists to uncover what they worked so hard to bury. If this case reminds you of another sealed room or forgotten heir, share it below, and subscribe before this trail vanishes like so many others. In the end, only one question remains. One that the ledgers themselves seem afraid to ask. Who was the Livingston the family fought so hard to forget? And to answer that, we must go back to the first fracture in the estate's foundation. The moment a single number in a ledger refused to balance. I drove north before dawn, following the river until the city thinned into farmland, the kind of quiet landscape the Gilded Age elite used as a buffer between their mansions, and the world they preferred not to acknowledge. The church appeared almost by accident, a narrow stone building tucked against a line of oaks, its bell tower leaning slightly, as if time had pushed it sideways. No one had sent me there. No archive had pointed the way. It was the ledger itself, the refusal of those numbers to balance, that led me to the kind of parish families like the Livingstons used whenever a birth needed to be acknowledged but not remembered. Inside, the air smelled of old wax and pages that had absorbed more secrets than prayers. The parish clerk didn't ask questions. He simply handed me a register bound in worn leather, its spine just fragile enough to suggest that someone had handled it carefully, perhaps too carefully, over the years. The baptism entry was clean. That was the first warning. Gilded Age records almost never were. They carried corrections, smudges, marginalia, little wars between ink and intent. But this line, dated late 1873, was pristine. Child, Male. Surname, Livingston. Residence, Eastern Holdings. The ink had held its color better than the other entries on the page, as if whoever wrote it had used a fresher pen or pressed harder, determined to make this child real in at least one place. And yet his name was reduced to an initial, just like the mysterious L. Livingston from the estate ledger. Inheritance law at the time allowed powerful families to obscure inconvenient children by registering them in rural parishes, bypassing civil authorities just enough to create a record without granting it legitimacy. The tactic was common, discreet, and understood by every major dynasty of the period, but only when there was a reason to keep the child out of the official line. I compared the parish book with the civil register. In the latter, 1873 was oddly thin for the Livingston estates. No new heirs, no additions to the family announcements that the newspapers loved to print in their Golden Age society columns. The silence wasn't natural, it was intentional. The baptism existed here and nowhere else, a lone thread stitched into a fabric that someone later tried to tear out. A silent witness, preserved by accident rather than design. The clerk watched me flip pages with the stiff caution of someone who had seen others follow this same trail and walk away before asking the wrong question. Outside, a carriage rolled past slowly, its wheels crunching gravel in a rhythm that made the wooden pews tremble as if the past had a pulse. When I stepped back to compare the handwriting, I noticed something faint. The edge of the child's surname hovered over a smoothed-out patch of paper, a place where another word had once been scraped away with a blade. Families of the Gilded Age were meticulous in the art of erasure. They preferred clean pages over messy truths. And here, in this tiny parish, I was holding the first undeniable sign that someone had tried to rewrite a life before it even had a chance to begin. Would you dare to open an archive like this, knowing it might contradict everything a dynasty claims about itself? The book felt heavier than its size should allow, as if the dark legacy of the Livingston name pressed against the cover from inside. I photographed the entry, but the image didn't calm me. It raised more questions. The date of the baptism aligned perfectly with the sudden transfer of land I had seen in the estate papers. Parcel 14B, reassigned quietly in the weeks after this forgotten ceremony. That land had changed hands without explanation, and now I understood the rhythm. Birth, denial, silence, relocation. Hidden heirs were often moved like property, not people. And as I traced the ink with my thumb, a whisper of something colder surfaced, the realization that the family might not have erased just his name, but his place in their world entirely. In the final shaft of morning light slicing through the stained glass window, I caught a glimpse of the page beneath the baptism. Entry. Someone had penciled a note in the margin long ago, then tried to rub it out. The words were almost gone, but not completely. A single letter remained, just one, pressed into the fiber of the paper. It was the same initial I had seen in the ledgers, the same mark that refused to be buried. And as the shadow of the church door crept across the floor, I realized that the next step in the trail led to the land itself. Land that should never have belonged to a child who, according to the official record, was never born. The letter dimmed under the moving shadow, and for a moment, it looked like a name being crossed out all over again. The road back from the parish wound through fields that once fed the Livingston fortune, though you wouldn't know it now. Most of the fences had collapsed into the soil, and the old stone walls, built by tenant farmers long dead, leaned like ribs exposed after a storm. But as I followed the path toward the main estate, something changed. The land grew too orderly, too intentional, the way property looks when someone is still tending to it long after the records claim it belongs to no one. A split-rail fence had been repaired recently. The grass lay pressed in narrow tracks where a carriage or wagon had passed. Whoever maintained those acres did so quietly, discreetly, as if the work itself were part of a conversation no one was supposed to overhear. The maps were my next guide. Folded inside the estate's 1874 legal file, they looked innocuous, survey lines, creek beds, boundary markers. But when spread on the long oak table beneath the library window, they revealed a fracture. A small cluster of acres on the eastern perimeter, directly adjacent to the Livingston Manor grounds, showed a change of ownership that seemed more like a sleight of hand. The land slipped out of the family's name for exactly 12 years, transferred not to a buyer but to a trust with no surname, only initials. Trusts were common in the Gilded Age. They shielded fortunes from taxes, lawsuits, scandal. But this one was different. It held nothing except those acres, and its beneficiary line was blank, a space where a name should have been written, yet wasn't. When I touched the paper, a ridge of ink caught the light, a signature removed with chemical solution long ago, leaving behind a faint indentation. Someone had erased ownership without disturbing the structure around it, like removing a photograph from a gilded frame while keeping the dust outline intact. I searched estate letters from the same period. Many were missing, but a few survived. One from an attorney in Manhattan carried a line that felt like a warning disguised as courtesy. The arrangement shall remain internal per your instruction. Sensitive beneficiaries rarely require documentation. Sensitive beneficiaries, hidden heirs, silent witnesses to an inheritance reshaped in the dark. A gust passed through the cracked window pane, rustling a pile of county notices. One page slid toward the floor, a property tax receipt from 1878, addressed not to the trust, but to the Livingston estate directly. The land had never changed address, only the paperwork had. It was a maneuver perfected by elite families of the era, separating legal ownership from economic benefit, keeping inconvenient heirs close enough to manage but far enough to deny. That required connections, judges who owed favors, clerks who understood when to look away, newspaper editors willing to let silence stand in place of headlines. The Livingstons had all of that. They could reshape their legacy the way others rearranged furniture, quietly and without witnesses, or at least without official ones. The more I read, the more the air inside the room shifted. Evening settled against the tall windows, turning the glass into mirrors. Behind me, the faint shape of the estate portrait gallery stretched into darkness. Rows of varnished faces watching from their frames. The Livingstons had posed. For these portraits with the dignity of people convinced their names would outlive every scandal. Yet one frame hung crooked, dust gathered unevenly at its edges, and the brass plaque beneath it had been removed. A rectangular shadow remained on the wall where a different plaque must have hung once, its outline sharper than the rest. Someone had rewritten not just documents, but the very story the walls were meant to tell. I opened the trust file again. A loose sheet slipped out, a land use note. From 1882, written in the hurried script of an estate steward. It mentioned repairs to a small tenant cottage near the river, materials allocated per the private directive. No tenant name, no contract, just that phrase, private directive. In the Gilded Age, that was code for matters the family wanted kept beyond the reach of genealogists, journalists, and sometimes even their own kin. What struck me most was the handwriting, a careful curve on the initial letter, identical to the curve in the parish baptism book. Two documents that should have belonged to different worlds, sharing the same ghost of a mark. I heard a floorboard shift behind me. Just the old house settling, I told myself, though the sound was soft, deliberate, like the slow exhale of a place tired of holding its tongue. I turned back to the map and traced the boundary lines with the tip of my finger. The trust had reintegrated the land in 1886 under revised succession considerations, a phrase lawyers used when they needed to move assets without inviting questions. Revised succession meant only one thing. The family line had been redrawn, quietly, permanently, without public acknowledgement. That boy from the parish record hadn't disappeared. He had been moved, accommodated, contained. As I folded the map, a corner of the paper snagged on something inside the file drawer. I reached in and pulled out a thin envelope pressed flat from decades of weight. No address, no seal. Inside, just a single photograph, faded, sepia, edges curled. A group posed on the estate lawn, 3 recognized Livingston heirs, and, standing slightly apart, a 4th young figure whose face had been scratched out with something sharp. The outline of his posture remained, shoulders straight, hands clasped behind him, as if trying to stand correctly for a legacy that refused to claim him. The scratches formed a perfect oval where his face should have been, an absence so precise it felt intentional, almost ritual. And, in the silence of the nearly empty gallery, with the evening pressing hard against the windows, the photograph seemed to breathe. The missing face watched me more clearly than the one still intact. The genealogical room of the Livingston estate was never meant to feel alive. Yet the moment I stepped inside, the air shifted as if the past were rearranging itself in the shadows. Shelves rose to the ceiling, carrying a century's worth of family books bound in leather the color of dried blood. Long table cut through the center of the room, polished smooth by generations of hands that believed a legacy could be controlled with ink. The lamps flickered once, as if acknowledging my presence, and the faint scent of paper, old, fragile, almost sweet, hovered like a warning. Genealogy in the Gilded Age was not a neutral act. It was architecture, reputation built in silence, and for families like the Livingstons, it was a fortress. I opened the first volume, an 1850 edition, and the pages crackled with confidence. Each name sat proudly in its branch, every marriage recorded, every child accounted for. Decorative flourishes framed the lines, the kind used in elite American families to signal order, purity, unbroken succession. But when I compared the book to its 1870 successor, the branches were no longer the same. A line that once extended into 3 smaller limbs now ended abruptly with a note in the margin: collateral branch discontinued. That phrase appeared again and again, haunting the newer editions like a polite euphemism layered over something more deliberate. Families didn't simply discontinue bloodlines, they erased them. The shift was subtle, names shortened without explanation, birth years adjusted by a digit, sibling orders rearranged. At first glance they looked like clerical corrections, but the deeper I read, the more the ink revealed hesitation. One date had been scraped with a blade, the paper beneath it thinned to near transparency. Another entry bore 2 competing handwritings, the original, faint and elegant, and a later correction pressed so deeply into the page that it left grooves on the sheet below. These weren't mistakes. These were revisions. A family tree rewritten not over generations but over strategy. A loose page slipped from between 2 books, landing near my hand with a whisper soft enough to feel intentional. It was a copied chart from the 1880s, the kind prepared for social almanacs, those glossy volumes that cataloged Gilded Age respectability. A circled name had been erased entirely, leaving only the faint tail of a letter behind, as if someone believed the ghost of an initial was easier to hide than the memory of a son. The space where his branch would have grown was left blank, a void pretending to be symmetry. When I turned the page, a draft family tree appeared, one clearly never meant to leave the estate. Pencil marks zigzagged across the lines, connecting and disconnecting names like an argument carried out between 2 historians who disagreed on the truth. One erased line led directly to a year, 1873, the year of the baptism that existed in one book and nowhere else, the year the land began changing hands without changing its address. And now, in these hidden drafts, the same year appeared again, circled in a graphite ring that had smudged over time, as though someone had pressed too hard in frustration or fear. A cold breeze rolled through the room despite the windows being shut, ruffling the edge of a ledger that lay half concealed under a velvet cloth. I lifted it gently. The cover bore the Livingston crest, but the weight of the book felt strange, as if it held more than names. Inside, the entries grew disjointed, notations squeezed into margins, arrows redirecting entire branches of ancestry. One line, drawn in pencil, connected a legitimate heir to an unnamed child marked only with an L. The marks were hesitant, as if the writer was testing the idea before committing to ink. It wasn't an official record. It was an internal debate. a private reckoning with a truth too dangerous for publication. The deeper I went, the more the room itself seemed unsettled. Floorboards gave muted creaks, the kind buildings make when they remember footsteps long vanished. A portrait hanging above the fireplace caught my eye, not because of the man it depicted, but because of the discoloration around the frame. It had been removed often, maybe too often. Families in the Gilded Age preferred their portraits to tell a single unified story. One misplaced canvas could crack the illusion, and here, the faint outline of a previous frame, larger, rectangular, unmistakably older, clung to the wallpaper like a shadow that resisted being peeled away. As I traced the penciled lines through the genealogical drafts, a pattern emerged. Each version of the family tree not only removed a name, but reshaped the branches around that absence, compensating for a missing heir by tightening the lineage. They weren't simply erasing the child. They were rebalancing the dynasty, preserving order in the face of an inconvenient truth. And yet, the more they tried to hide him, the clearer his silhouette became. One page, brittle at the edges, revealed the most unsettling detail. Next to a faintly erased birth entry was a notation written in hurried script. Line adjusted, "Do not publish." The letters trembled slightly, as if the writer's hand had paused mid-stroke, caught between duty and doubt. The O. Adjustment was simple, too simple. A single branch redirected, a connection severed. But the residue of the original line remained, a pale impression where the pencil had once traveled before someone rubbed it away. I leaned closer, and under the angled lamplight, the erased name reappeared just enough to decipher its first letter. The same initial that had haunted the baptism, the land trust, the ledger margins. A single letter, hanging in the air like an accusation. And as I closed the book, the lamp flickered again, casting the shadow of the erased branch onto the wall, thin, trembling, impossible to ignore. It looked like the outline of a door that wasn't on any blueprint of the estate, a door that led not to a room, but to a truth sealed away for generations. The tree had been rewritten, but the silence around the missing name was louder than ink. And in that heavy, breathless quiet, I realized the next page was waiting. One that would force the dynasty to confront the child they had tried so hard to forget. The first clue to the child's existence did not appear in a ledger or a family book, but in something far more mundane. A school receipt printed on cheap paper, the kind rural institutions used when they expected their records to be forgotten. It was folded into a square, so tight the creases felt like scars. The date matched the winter after the baptism, and the signature belonged to a local teacher whose hand trembled in every surviving document. The payment was in cash, no bank reference, no Livingston surname, just the initials LL written in a hurried script. A child reduced to 2 letters, attending a school so far from the manor that no one would associate him with the golden halls on the hill. The ink wavered slightly at the edges, as though the writer had hesitated before committing those initials. Even the paper seemed to understand the weight of recording someone whose existence hovered between acknowledgement and erasure. A second trace emerged from the county health register. Buried among entries of broken limbs, fevers, and harvest injuries was a line describing a boy of fragile constitution residing near the eastern estate boundary. No first name, no guardian listed, just a note that the supervising physician had been compensated privately, followed by a mark that resembled the faint, familiar curve of the Livingston initial. The medical ledger smelled of dust and antiseptic, like rooms the Gilded Age elite pretended they never needed, where truth seeped through the cracks in ways society columns never captured. The phrasing was restrained, clinical, but the subtext lingered like a strain carried silently through generations. The boy existed, and someone with wealth made sure he survived, without ever stepping into the light. The final fragment came from the estate's correspondence archive, tucked between letters about tenant disputes and crop yields. A folded note, written by an administrator who rarely allowed emotion to touch the page, contained a single chilling sentence. The boy must be cared for, but not exhibited. The word exhibited hung in the air, echoing the museum-like expectations placed on heirs of the Gilded Age. Legitimate sons were displayed, at galas, in portraits, in the pages of society papers. They were proof of continuity, proof of order, proof of superiority. But a hidden heir. He was a liability, a crack in the marble facade, a reminder that even golden dynasties had shadows. The room around me seemed to tighten as I pieced the fragments together. The windows reflected only silhouettes now, the outlines of shelves crowded with documents that had outlived the people who tried to control them. A faint tapping echoed from the rafters, like a hesitant heartbeat embedded in the wood. The silence carried weight, not emptiness, but compression, the way a sealed room holds air that has been waiting too long to escape. Each clue I uncovered made the outline of the child sharper, not softer. He wasn't a ghost story whispered by staff or an invention of revisionist historians. He was real, a boy whose life had been financed, monitored, protected, and simultaneously erased. The mechanics of concealment were almost elegant. Small payments in cash, medical care without documentation, schooling handled discreetly to avoid social inquiry. This wasn't neglect, it was management. A quiet, methodical effort to keep him living just far enough from the main house to be forgotten, but close enough that the family could control every breath he took. The deeper I descended into the archive, the more the questions swirled with an unsettling steadiness. Would I speak, knowing what a revelation like this would mean for a name as heavy as Livingston? Or would I do what generations of archivists, clerks, and family stewards had done? Stay silent beneath the weight of inherited power. The era trained people to protect legacies, not truths. Golden Age secrets were polished until they gleamed, even when built on erased records and silent witnesses. A beam of light fell across the table as the last envelope slipped from my hand. It landed beside a genealogy notebook, its leather worn thin at the corners. I opened it out of instinct, expecting the same curated branches from before. But this one was different. On the inside cover, someone had penciled a list of children's names, each one with a birth year beside it. All legitimate, all recorded, and beneath them, a single initial, L, followed by a date that had been rubbed nearly to ash. The graphite smear spread across the page like a bruise. The attempt to erase the child was clumsy compared to the polished work elsewhere. It was raw, desperate, almost human. A final attempt to protect a dynasty already standing on trembling ground. As I traced the erased date with the back of my nail, the page shifted, revealing a faint outline beneath, an indentation in the paper where a full name had once been written before, being carved away. The indentation caught the light, forming the shape of letters that no longer existed, and for a moment it resembled not handwriting, but a doorway. A narrow, unmarked door. A door that did not appear on any blueprint of the estate. A door that felt less like an architectural feature, and more like a warning carved into the past. The archive went still, as though listening, and the silence pressed in with the weight of decades. Whatever lay behind that invisible door had, waited a long time to be found. The farther I moved into the architectural heart of the Livingston estate, the more the house seemed to shift under its own history, as though walls carried muscles, memory, and rooms remembered who had passed through them, and who had been kept out. Old mansions from the Gilded Age often behaved like living machines, built with compartments of privilege and pockets of silence, but this one felt engineered for omission. The blueprints told the story long before the family ever would. Spread across a wide drafting table, the earliest plan from the 1860s showed a clearly labeled room tucked behind the main library. Private archive. A narrow chamber, windowless, with shelving marked for deeds, correspondence, and records of internal arrangements. But by the 1890 update, that same space appeared under a different name, Study Annex. And in the 1902 blueprint, the room vanished entirely, its outline absorbed by the walls, its function erased with the ease of ink lifted from parchment. A room once dedicated to documentation, transformed into a geographical ghost. The floor beneath me creaked with an old, reluctant sound as I stepped toward the far side of the hall. There, a corridor too narrow for servants and too inconvenient for guests extended like a forgotten artery. Dust lined the baseboards, stirring only when the draft shifted through unseen gaps. Halfway down the passage stood a door that didn't match the others. Older wood, darker grain. The brass handle dulled to a bruised copper tone. It wasn't on a single blueprint, not in 1860, not in 1890, not in any renovation list. Houses from this era often contained forbidden rooms, spaces used not for living, but for hiding papers, hiding people, hiding truths the family couldn't risk letting into the parlors or the social columns that curated their spotless reputations. When I pushed the door, it resisted at first, then opened with a sound like a book being unsealed after years in storage. The room inside was small, oppressive, and dry. Unnaturally dry, the way basements of wealthy families tended to be when they were built to protect paper rather than wine. A single wooden table stood in the center, its surface marked with faint scratches that looked like the impressions of ledgers once stacked in careful piles. The shelves were empty now, but each board carried the subtle indentation of volumes long removed. The room felt like a throat that had swallowed secrets and was still holding them somewhere in the dark. Across from the table, a metal strongbox sat embedded in the wall, flush with the stone surface as though the masonry had formed around it. Bankers who worked with Gilded Age dynasties often offered embedded storage, a service designed for documents that could not risk circulation, even within trusted institutions. Opening such a box would have required two keys, one held by the family's patriarch, the other by a private banker sworn to discretion. The Livingston accounts listed several safe deposit boxes over the decades, each identified only by protocol numbers instead of names. Some boxes showed contents, others simply recorded pending items, a euphemism used when the description itself could cause scandal. Among the oldest entries, one number recurred in silent, rhythmic intervals, as though the box held documents that were moved in and out with ritualistic care. I found the matching number on the wall-mounted strongbox. The metal was cool beneath my fingertips, colder than the air in the room, as if it still held the memory of guarded hands. A vertical scratch ran across the lock plate, shallow but unmistakable, a sign of someone's hesitation, or perhaps an attempt to open it without the required key. It was hard not to imagine an attorney standing here decades ago, weighing the cost of protecting a dynasty against the cost of protecting a child. The inventory logs from the Livingston banking partners, which I had reviewed earlier, listed contents of their safe deposit holdings with deliberate vagueness. Box 14B, maps. Box 22A, correspondence. Box 31C, internal accounts for estate upkeep. And then Box 47, always Box 47, simply, by directive. No description, no category, no initials. Papers moved from a room that no longer existed into a safe that didn't want to be named, overseen by clerks who were never allowed to see what they were transporting. If the forgotten heir had a file, baptism, expenses, medical notes, trust directives, it would have lived in spaces like these: a basement, a locked corridor, a box named only by number. The mansion seemed to tighten around me as I stepped back into the hallway. The air shifted in a way that felt almost aware, as if the house recognized its own omissions. A draft traveled along the floorboards, brushing dust against my shoes. Somewhere behind the walls, the pipes groaned softly, a sound too deliberate to be mere old plumbing. Wealthy families of the Gilded Age often designed their homes with hidden conduits between rooms, small passages for staff, or in rare cases, for the movement of sensitive materials. Even air could carry secrets if a house was built with enough intention. Farther down the corridor, I found a second door. This one was newer, polished, and marked storage in block letters that felt too modern, too sterile for a house that prided itself on antique authenticity. The knob turned easily, but the door refused to open more than 2 inches before catching against something heavy on the other side. I pushed gently, The object shifted with a muted scrape, releasing a faint scent of dried leather. When I finally slipped through the narrow opening, I saw what blocked the door. A cabinet of architectural plans stacked haphazardly on top of each other, rolls of parchment protruding like limbs. Someone had tried to bury the room by clutter rather than by demolition. I pulled one of the charts from the stack. It showed the second floor plan, labeled meticulously by an architect in 1911. But along the west wing, where the genealogical room stood, one section was shaded in gray. No notes, no measurements, just a blank silhouette in the shape of a room. A void, the blueprint equivalent of erasure. Like the missing name in the genealogy book, the rubbed-out date, the initial carved into a line where a full identity should have been. The geography of omission was everywhere, in walls, in maps, in the architecture of power itself. As I laid the blueprint across the cabinet, the lamplight caught on a small tear in the paper. Someone had tried to fold the page in a way that concealed the shaded void, but the paper fought back, leaving a scar. The tear aligned perfectly with the doorway that didn't appear on any floor plan, the one I had just passed through. A doorway meant to be unseen. A doorway that protected something, or someone, from ever reaching the official record. And as the room exhaled, its centuries of dust around me, the blueprint's shadow cut across the floor, landing directly on an old storage trunk in the corner, its lid scratched by a single straight line. Clean, deliberate. A name once written there, now carved away. The silence that followed felt heavier than the stone foundations beneath my feet. The kind of silence that gathers before a truth finally forces its way through the last locked door. The Livingston mansion could hide a child, a room, even an entire branch of a family tree, but it could never have done it alone. For that, it needed a different kind of architecture, the kind built not from stone and timber, but from stationery, letterhead, and signatures arranged like gears in a clock. When I left the corridors of forbidden rooms and stepped into the world of ledgers and legal paper, the pattern became sharper, colder, almost mechanical. The same names kept reappearing, not in portraits, but in the fine print. The law firm of Kavanaugh and Hartwell, and a discreet Manhattan bank on Broadway, whose marble lobby was built to reassure anyone with a dark legacy they needed polished before the public ever saw it. In the reading room of the city archives, their correspondence lay in ordered stacks, bound by twine gone brittle with age. The law firm's letterhead was adorned with sober flourishes, no excess, no warmth, just the quiet confidence of men who had spent decades arranging other people's futures. I unfolded one letter dated 1874. It did not mention the child by name. None of them ever did. Instead, the partners wrote of heir contingencies and the necessity of preserving the core succession while attending to peripheral obligations. Peripheral obligations. In the Gilded Age, that phrase carried more weight than most court rulings. It meant there were lives orbiting the center of power, lives that needed funding, supervision, silence, but no recognition. Further down the page, a sentence had been lightly scored with a blade as, though someone had reconsidered how much truth belonged on paper, arrangements related to the events of '73 must remain internal. Explicit mention risks destabilizing the public perception of the line. The year was there, the same year as the baptism, the land trust, the erased initial. The words were not. Only their outline remained, pressed into the paper like a quiet confession. Around me, the archive hummed with the faint shuffle of other researchers, but at that table, the silence grew. Dense, carrying the weight of conversations that had once taken place behind walnut doors and drawn velvet curtains. The bank records told the same story in a different language. Their ledgers did not speak of children or scandal. They listed rural administration funds, special encumbrances, periodic disbursement per standing directive. Columns of figures marched in precise formation, each entry steady, almost tranquil. Yet when I followed the flow of money on the page, it moved with uncanny rhythm. Monthly deposits tied to no named heir, withdrawn at intervals that matched the school terms and medical visits of a boy no one would admit existed. The accounts were technically ownerless, attached instead to codes and protocol numbers, as if the bank itself had been trained to serve hidden heirs without ever daring to call them that. In one memorandum between bank officers, a manager noted a recurring transfer. Client, Livingston Estate. Purpose, continued support of rural. Dependent, documentation remains at client's counsel per agreement. The phrase remains at client's counsel appeared more than once. It was a subtle handoff, a way of saying, we will move the money, you will keep the story. Law firms and bankers became silent witnesses, paid not only to execute instructions, but to absorb guilt by proximity. Their offices were the new forbidden rooms. No dust, no locked trunks, just polished desks where erased records passed from hand to hand and left no trace. In public archives, back within the firm's files, the pattern deepened. Drafts of wills showed revisions over the decades. Names shifted and clauses tightened. Kavanaugh and Hartwell proposed language that could remove an heir without ever writing his name down. Phrases like, any issue not recognized under the public line, and those whose maintenance has been otherwise provided for. Each draft bore small check marks in the margins, the ink thinner in some places, thicker in others, as though every stroke had been weighed against the potential cost of scandal. Somewhere between these sentences lived the boy reduced to an initial, the hidden heir who was simultaneously provided for and written out. A later memo, typed in the early 20th century as the golden age secrets of the prior generation began to harden into myth, summarized the firm's stance in chillingly neutral terms. Objective remains to safeguard the central succession, avoid dilution of public inheritance claims, and minimize exposure of historical contingencies. Existing discrete provisions are to be continued without formal acknowledgement. The words were dry, almost bored, but beneath them lay a quiet admission. This had gone on for so long that it had become routine, not a moral crisis, a line item. Outside, carriage wheels had long since given way to automobiles, but in these papers, the world stayed frozen in a time when lawyers and bankers functioned as the invisible beams holding up the facades of mansions. They knew which doors stayed closed, which rooms remained unlisted, which names were never spoken above a whisper. Families like the Livingstons did not erase alone. They employed craftsmen of silence, men who could adjust a family tree, redirect a trust, or carve a child out of the public record, all without leaving more than an initial in the margins. A stray draft fell from a bundle as I shifted the stack. It bore the firm's watermark, but no salutation, just a fragment of language. Under heavy revision, should matters relating to prior unacknowledged issue ever surface in public. The sentence broke off there, replaced by a thick line of ink that blacked out whatever had been considered too dangerous to preserve. Below the redaction, someone had written one word by hand. Contained. No context, no elaboration, just that. The ink had begun to fade, but the gesture remained sharp. Contained. Like a room bricked over. Like a door that doesn't appear on any plan. Like a portrait with a face scratched away. I set the page gently beside the others. The machinery of disappearance was no longer an abstraction. It was here, in these cross-referenced files, law firm letterhead, bank memoranda, trust agreements, all moving in concert to keep one life permanently off stage. And yet, for all their precision, these documents shared one peculiar absence. Nothing, not once, made it into the society pages. No hint of dispute, no rumor of scandal, no whisper that the Livingston line had ever been anything less than pristine. The house had its forbidden rooms. The archives had their erased records. The ledgers had their silent witnesses. And the newspapers? They had nothing. On the last memo I examined, in the lower right corner where signatures usually sat, there was only a small, deliberate mark, one stroke of ink drawn through an empty line where a name should have been. as if the person responsible for approving the silence had chosen to vanish even from their own record. It looked less like a signature and more like a name crossed out before it was ever written. The city's newspaper archive was nothing like the quiet corridors of the Livingston estate, yet the silence there was just as deliberate. Rows of bound volumes lined the walls, their spines stamped with dates in flaking gold, chronicles of a gilded age that had never imagined its secrets would be read beneath fluorescent lights and humming microfilm machines. I sat at a long wooden table, surrounded by the ghosts of headlines, and rolled the year 1873 into focus. If there had ever been a moment for scandal, it was here. The other great families proved it. Column after column chronicled their quarrels, cousins dragging each other into court over disputed wills, siblings contesting dowries, uncles cut from inheritances and airing grievances in open hearings. The press loved it. Hidden heirs, contested estates, golden age secrets spilling across the front pages. These stories sold. Papers and shaped reputations in equal measure. But when the name Livingston appeared, the tone shifted. There were no court disputes, no whispers of illegitimate claimants or contested trusts, just polite notices of philanthropy and culture. A donation to a conservatory here, a speech at a museum there, a subscription to a hospital fund quietly renewed. The family's name flowed smoothly through society columns, untouched by controversy at precisely the moment their private papers showed a maelstrom. Trusts being restructured, genealogies rewritten, rooms repurposed into forbidden rooms to house inconvenient documents. The public record looked like calm water. The private archive confirmed there had been a storm. I let the microfilm spin backward and forward between 1873 and 1875, watching as other dynasties fractured in full view. One railroad magnate's will ignited a weeks-long debate in print. A shipping family's secret second marriage surfaced in a lurid trial, complete with sketches in the illustrated supplements. Meanwhile, the Livingstons glided past under headlines like prominent patron of the arts and distinguished host at Hudson Estate gathering. It wasn't that the newspapers didn't know how to hunt for blood, they just chose not to smell it here. Occasional clues glimmered at the edges, a brief mention of adjustments to rural holdings, buried in a financial column most readers would have skipped, a cryptic reference to internal settlement after a quiet visit by family counsel to a local court. Tiny phrases, easily dismissed, but perfectly aligned with the machinery of disappearance already mapped in the law firm's files and bank ledgers. It was as if the public narrative had been carefully combed, any knot that hinted at a hidden heir smoothed out before ink ever touched paper. In the Gilded Age, power didn't simply reside in wealth or land. It lived in the relationship between families and the press. Editors relied on aristocratic names for society coverage, charity galas, cultural events that lent prestige to their pages. In return, certain stories were never written. A reporter who pushed too hard on a dark legacy might find themselves reassigned, their notes quietly misplaced. An editor who printed the wrong rumor could lose advertising from allied banks or be frozen out of the most coveted ballrooms in the city. So some scandal belonged to the new money families, loud, unpolished, unprotected. For names like Livingston, silence itself became a kind of headline. No disputes, no stains, no mention of a child who existed only in erased records and silent witnesses. I turned the pages of a bound volume for 1874, the newsprint softened by age. The Livingston estates appeared again, but only as backdrops, hosts of soirees, lenders of paintings, patrons of orchestras. No hint that miles away from the Golden Halls, a boy's schooling was paid for in cash, his medical care labeled private, his life quietly secured by money that moved like a shadow beneath official ledgers. The contrast between what the papers printed and what the archives had preserved was almost surgical. Public calm, private surgery. A crisis fully contained. What would you do if you found a file like this, buried among harmless Gilded Age paperwork? If, after hours of reading about floral arrangements and cotillions, you opened a folder misfiled under miscellaneous, and found draft articles that never made it to print, paragraphs crossed out, names replaced with initials, references to an additional Livingston Heir neatly struck through. Would you read them once and close the folder, letting the dark legacy rest? Or would you trace every stroke of ink, knowing that bringing a hidden heir into the light means pulling apart the scaffolding that kept an entire family's image intact? As the decades turned on the microfilm reel, the barrier between public and private began to slip. Estates dwindled. Heirs died without children. The banks consolidated. Law firms merged. Boxes once kept in basement vaults and numbered strong boxes found new homes in university collections and historical societies. The Livingston papers, once guarded by clerks who knew exactly what not to say, were relabeled with accession numbers and cardboard slips, processed by archivists who saw files, not dynasties. That's how the ledgers, the baptism registers, the trust drafts, and the quiet memos about heir contingencies ended up on the same shelves. As museum pamphlets and church newsletters, just another set of documents waiting for the first pair of eyes willing to see what the newspapers chose not to. I wound the reel to a stop and removed it from the machine. On the table beside me lay a thin folder the archivist had delivered without ceremony, pulled from a box labeled simply Unsorted Clippings, 19th C. Inside were small, yellowed scraps, society announcements, partial obituaries, column proofs marked up in pencil. Near the back, one page caught the light differently. It was a layout mock-up, a society column draft featuring an upcoming Livingston event. Between two paragraphs about an art exhibition and a charitable luncheon, there was a single narrow line of text that someone had tried to erase with fierce, repeated strokes. At the right angle, with just enough light, the buried words emerged. An additional heir to be presented. The rest of the sentence dissolved into paper fibers. Above it, in the editor's hand, a thick E. Line of blue pencil cut straight through the phrase, so deep it had scored the next sheet underneath. A quiet correction. A choice. A name that almost stepped into public view and was pulled back at the last possible moment. The page lay flat and harmless in front of me. Just another fragment from a long-dead newsroom. But that single ruined line of type, crossed out before it ever met the presses, sat between the Golden Age secrets and the official record like a door that never opened, but was always there, waiting. By the time the 20th century had finished sanding down the sharp edges of the Gilded Age, the people who orchestrated the Livingston disappearance were gone. What remained was their paperwork, and even that no longer stayed where they had intended it to. Banks merged, collapsed, or rebranded. Law firms dissolved, their partners' names surviving only on brass plaques sold at auction. Storage fees went unpaid. Executors died without heirs who cared enough to keep entire rooms of old documents intact. And so the machinery of disappearance that had once been tightly controlled began to loosen, not out of justice, but out of entropy. In a quiet university library, 2 states away from the Hudson, I stood in front of a rolling ladder, reading box labels written by someone who never imagined the name Livingston would mean anything more than Northeastern estate papers. The cardboard was modern, the handwriting not. Some boxes were marked with grand phrases: railroad bonds, 1890s, industrial expansion files, while others were reduced to bare numbers: accession, 47-3, unsorted legal. When the contents of a failing private bank had been donated to the university in the 1960s, the archivists had done what archivists always do when confronted with a wall of unpromising material. They stabilized hinges, removed rusty staples, and wrote down what they could see on the surface. To them, these were account statements, mortgage forms, correspondence between anonymous attorneys and even more anonymous clients. They were not hunting Golden Age secrets or hidden heirs. They were just trying to keep paper from turning to dust. I signed the call slip and waited while a cart rattled softly through the stacks, returning with 3 unspectacular gray boxes. The first held what the finding aid promised: routine trust schedules, clipped newspaper interest rate tables, circulars from now-defunct banks reassuring depositors after panics. No one remembered. The second box, labeled simply Client Files, Rural, was where the story began to reassemble itself. A folder with a fading tab carried only a protocol number. Inside were documents stamped with an old bank's crest and the name of a law firm I already knew too well, Kavanaugh and Hartwell. The archivist had added a pencil note to the folder decades earlier. Livingston related, followed by a question mark. A single baptism receipt from the countryside mismatched to the surrounding papers had triggered their doubt. They had not pursued it. Archivists are not detectives. Their task is to describe, not solve. So the receipt for a nameless boy's schooling, the memorandum about rural dependents, and the schedule of special encumbrances linked to an unnumbered land parcel sat quietly for years, waiting for someone who recognized what those fragments meant when read together. Across town, in a historical society housed in a converted bank building, another piece of the puzzle waited behind a counter polished by 100 grant-funded projects. The institution had inherited the non-current archives of a regional trust company after a merger. Surplus records had arrived in bulk, tied with twine, stamped with dates and little else. Only much later, when a diligent staff member cross-referenced a set of protocol numbers with the university's donation list, did they realize that one of their anonymous boxes was a missing half of the same sequence I had. Seen on the Livingston strongbox. I requested that box next. When it arrived, the cardboard corners gave a soft sigh as I opened the lid. Inside were deposit logs, key check-in forms, and the sort of internal memos clerks scribble when they suspect their instructions might be referenced again. Box 47, the one that had carried no description in the old bank index, appeared repeatedly. Box 47, accessed by counsel only. Box 47, transferred to new vault, retain original numbering. Box 47, contents. Reviewed, no change. No list of what those contents were. Just the reassurance that whatever lay inside had been examined and left alone. In another era, those papers would have remained scattered. Here a baptism entry, there a land transfer, elsewhere a genealogical draft with an erased name. But archivists, driven by different instincts than the lawyers and bankers who came before them, began to notice patterns. A penciled note in the margin of a university catalog entry read, "See also, Livingston Family Papers, Private Deposit, Hudson County." A cross-reference at the Historical Society suggested, possible match to rural estate in Eastern Hudson records. Each connection was small, tentative, written without drama. Yet step by step, like someone following faint footprints across a tiled floor, the path emerged. Sitting at a long wooden table under the sloping roof of the university's special collections room, I spread the fragments out in front of me. The parish baptism copied, years ago by a careful village clerk. The trust transfer that moved land to a faceless box and then quietly back again. The genealogical notebook with its initial carved into the paper where a full name had once lived. The school receipt, the medical note, the administrator's line. The boy must be cared for, but not exhibited. Each had traveled its own route, from manor to office, from office to bank, from bank to some anonymous storage room, and finally through donations and corporate collapses into the hands of archivists who treated them as individual artifacts, not as pieces of a dark legacy. Only when they were reunited on that table did the narrative the family had tried so hard to prevent become unmistakable. This was no longer just the story of one Gilded Age mansion and its forbidden rooms, or one set of hidden heirs. It was a blueprint of how power operated, how law firms, bankers, and editors worked together to keep certain stories out of sight, how the machinery of disappearance depended on everyone involved believing that omission was a lesser sin than exposure. Outside, the late afternoon light shifted against the high windows, turning the glass into a muted mirror. Behind me, shelves of other collections stood in quiet ranks, other dynasties, other families, other peripheral obligations that had slipped from private crisis into public archive. The Livingston papers were not an exception. They were a mirror. For every erased record here, there were likely dozens more waiting in boxes mislabeled miscellaneous or unidentified client ledgers. Hidden heirs, silent witnesses, erased records, all filed alphabetically, waiting for someone to ask the right question. The archivist who had handed me the boxes walked past again, pausing just long enough to glance at the spread of documents. Their gaze lingered on the baptism copy and the trust schedule, but they said nothing. Perhaps they had always suspected there was a story buried in this material. Perhaps, like so many before them, they had decided that naming it outright was not their role. The room hummed softly with the sound of the climate control system, the steady, artificial breeze that preserves paper better than any gilded hall ever did. At the bottom of one folder, nearly glued by time to the cardboard, I found a single, thin strip of paper, a clipping that had slipped the binder's attention. It was not a headline or a full article, just a fragment of a typeset family. Notice. The Livingston name appeared in bold, followed by a list of heirs as printed in some long-ago society column. Someone, at some point, had underlined the list in faint pencil and added a small bracket in the margin. Just outside that bracket, in a hand I recognized from the old law firm drafts, there was one more word. It had been written, then struck through with a single hard line, a first name that never appeared in any official family tree. The ink of that crossed-out name had begun to fade, but the pressure of the stroke remained, embossed into the paper. It was the one place where public and private records briefly touched, where the forgotten heir almost stepped into print before being shoved back into the dark. And there, on the reading room table, under neutral institutional light instead of chandelier glow, the crossed-out name contradicted every polished genealogy and carefully curated history the Livingston family had ever allowed into the world. The paper did not move. The ink did not change. But the silence that settled around that single mutilated word felt like a door, one that had been kept shut for a century and was no longer entirely closed. Spread out across the table, the Livingston fragments stopped looking like isolated curiosities and started to resemble what they really were, a manual. Not just for one family, but for a whole class. The baptism in a rural parish. The land that changed owners without changing address. The genealogies. Rewritten in pencil first and ink later, the trusts managed with phrases like peripheral obligations and special encumbrances. None of it was improvised. It was a system. A way of making sure the facade of the dynasty remained intact, even if a hidden heir existed just beyond the edge of the portrait frame. In the Gilded Age, the line between legitimate and undesirable was spoken of as if it were carved in marble, but the paperwork told a different story. That line was negotiated in quiet. Rooms, across desks polished by generations of lawyers and bankers. The decision was almost always the same. Better to adjust a succession discreetly than expose the truth. Better to support a child at a distance than allow his name into the Golden Age secrets that families told about themselves in society columns and commemorative books. The Livingston case just made visible what many dynasties did as a matter of routine. On one side of that negotiation stood the public heirs, the ones who appeared in newspapers, posed for portraits, hosted the charity balls. Their lives were framed by visible privileges, mansions opened for visiting dignitaries, private rail cars linked quietly to grand hotels, seats reserved at the opera. On the other side, in the shadows cast by those same chandeliers, stood the people who absorbed the cost of preserving the story. Children reduced to initials, women whose names never made it into the genealogies, relatives paid to move away, servants who knew too much. The forgotten heir of the Livingston line was one of those people, kept alive by the fortune, but never invited fully into it. The political logic was simple. A dynasty that admitted its line was negotiable risked losing more than reputation. In a world where family names underpinned business empires, seats on boards and quiet understandings in legislative back rooms, acknowledging an inconvenient branch could mean splitting votes, diluting control, inviting legal challenges. Quietly, rearranging property, shifting acres into a trust, directing income into accounts with no visible owner, instructing counsel to adjust the tree, kept the core intact. The public line remained clean, the dark legacy was managed off-stage. Socially, the cost was diffused through a network of silent witnesses. A village teacher who understood that LL on a receipt did not need a full surname. A doctor who accepted private payment and left the guardian line blank. A clerk in a law office who learned over time which files were never to be mentioned by name. None of them held the whole story. Each carried one tile of the mosaic. The risk for them was different than for the family. Not the loss of a mansion, but the loss of a job, a reference, the thin protection that came from being useful to those who owned the biggest houses on the hill. Financially, this practice of maintaining hidden heirs while erasing them from the official record created a quiet redistribution of the estate, one that never showed up in published balance sheets. Funds that might have gone into reinvestment or visible philanthropy instead flowed into rural administration, special charges, and unspecified care. The dynasty remained stable on paper. The price was simply moved into the margins where, it was assumed, future readers would never look. And yet here, in the archive, those margins had outlived everyone who wrote them. What makes the Livingston case so revealing is not just what happened to one child, but how familiar the pattern looks when held up against other collections. In other families' papers, the same habits appear. Pages torn neatly from family Bibles, leaving a suspicious gap in the births around a certain year. Wills with entire paragraphs rewritten in a different hand. Property that slides sideways into the control of a trust before returning, cleaned, to the main line. The names change. Railroad magnates, shipping barons, industrial tycoons, but the structure remains. Hidden heirs kept just close enough to manage, just distant enough to deny. Walk through enough special collections, and you start to recognize the geography of omission. The forbidden rooms in mansions, the unlabeled boxes in bank archives, the unindexed folders in law firm donations. You see how Gilded Age reputations were not accidental. They were engineered. When newspapers chose not to see, when family histories skipped a generation, it was rarely because nothing had happened. It was because somebody, somewhere, had decided that silence was safer. So what does a forgotten heir mean for a dynasty? It means the story that dynasty told about itself was never fully true. It means the family's version of order depended on an agreement to treat some lives as footnotes that could be removed when inconvenient. It means the supposedly solid categories, legitimate, illegitimate, inside, outside, were held together by fear and negotiation, not by moral certainty. Someone gained stability, the heirs whose inheritance was never challenged in open court. Someone lost rights, the child whose claim was absorbed into trust language and erased records. And someone carried the risk, the intermediaries whose signatures sit at the bottom of documents they could never discuss. As I sat there, the Livingston papers no longer felt like the story of a single house with golden age secrets locked behind its doors. They looked more like a mirror held up to an entire era. For every erased initial here, how many others lay dormant in collections labeled miscellaneous family papers? For every Livingston, how many other surnames depended on the same choreography, adjusted genealogies, redirected lands, silent witnesses who grew old without ever naming what they had seen? The archive around me absorbed the question without offering comfort. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly. A cart squeaked in the distance. Somewhere, a scanner head slid across a page, turning ink into pixels. The machinery of disappearance had given way to a different kind of machine, one that preserves rather than conceals, but the imbalance remained. The official histories hanging in museums still tell smooth stories about great men and their unbroken lines. Only here in the boxes and folders do the fractures show. On the table, the clipping with the crossed-out name lay beside a clean, printed family tree from a much later commemorative volume. In the book, the Livingston line ran E. straight and proud, every branch neatly labeled, every heir accounted for. Next to it, the fragment from the typeset column showed that same list, plus one more word, written in proof, then slashed away before publication. The book and the scrap did not agree. One object confirmed the dynasty's official version. The other contradicted it in 8 letters and a single hard stroke of blue pencil. The air in the reading room didn't change, but the space between those 2 documents did. It felt, dense, like the pause before a verdict is read. And as the camera lingers, in your mind or on the page, we're left with that image, the polished, published tree on one side, and on the other, a mutilated name that never made it into the light, lying there like a thin, silent crack running straight through the story a dynasty spent a century trying to tell. By the time I had traced the forgotten heir through ledgers, land maps, baptism books, forbidden rooms, and bank protocols, the Livingston file no longer looked like a curiosity from a single house on the Hudson. It sat on the table like a miniature city, streets of paper, alleys of marginalia, courtyards of silence. If you stepped back far enough, you could see the outline of something larger. Not just a family protecting its name, but an era teaching itself how to remember selectively. In the Gilded Age, wealth built railroads, mansions, and museums. But just as carefully, it built archives of convenience, stories polished for public view and stories pushed into the dark. Piece by piece, the pattern emerges. A boy reduced to initials in a rural parish register, his full name preserved only in the pressure of a pen that someone later tried to erase. Acres temporarily exiled into a trust, then folded back into the main estate once the line of succession had been revised. Genealogies where branches appear in early drafts and vanish in later editions, replaced by phrases like collateral branch discontinued. Law firms, writing about heir contingencies and peripheral obligations instead of people, bankers managing accounts whose true owners never appear in print. Newspapers, hungry for scandal, somehow missing this one entirely. Together, these are not accidents. They are the machinery of forgetting, oiled by fear and habit. Families like the Livingstons didn't just accumulate capital, they curated memory. They decided which romances became marriages graced by engravings in the Sunday supplements, and which were relegated to whispers in back stairwells. They chose which children grew up framed in oil above the mantel, and which were kept off the walls, living in the margins of ledgers and the shadows of tenant cottages. The Golden Age secrets of a dynasty were not only affairs and bankruptcies, they were editorial decisions about who counted as real. The Hidden Heir of 1873 was simply the one case where enough paper survived to sketch the outline of the choice. Inside the mansion, this control took architectural form. Rooms renamed on blueprints, doors that did not appear where the walls insisted they existed, forbidden rooms that once housed strongboxes and files marked private archive. Outside, it moved through institutions, law offices where names were converted into phrases, banks where a life support became rural administration, editors' desks where a line about an additional heir to be presented was scored out in blue pencil before the presses ever rolled. Each space had its own logic, its own language, but all served the same purpose. In a world obsessed with order and lineage, forgetting became a tool, precise, deliberate, repeatable. Standing in that university reading room, surrounded by gray archival boxes, you realize how selective the survival of evidence really is. These papers exist not because the dynasty wanted them preserved, but because the institutions that once depended on their secrecy eventually failed, merged, or decluttered. File rooms emptied. Non-current records were offered to libraries with little ceremony. A banker's cache of trust agreements, a law firm's closing inventory, a historical society's donation of miscellaneous local estates. Each transfer loosened the grip of private control. What began as a crisis to be contained inside a single family gradually diluted into anonymous paperwork, available to anyone with a library card and enough patience to follow faint numbers across collections. And yet, even now, what we reconstruct is incomplete. For every ledger that reached an archive, another was probably burned in a basement furnace on a winter night when coal ran low. For every erased record we can still read at an angle, others were sliced cleanly from register books, leaving only the too neat gap of missing pages. The forbidden rooms we can still enter are the ones someone forgot to lock properly when the house was sold. The truly dangerous files, those naming names outright, those letters written in moments of panic, may already be ash. The Livingston file is not the full story. It is the residue of a much larger choreography. In that sense, it becomes a mirror of the Gilded Age itself. We talk about the era in broad strokes: industrial titans, glittering ballrooms, labor unrest, great fortunes made overnight. But the archive reveals quieter truths. How many hidden heirs were supported from a distance in exactly this way, their existence acknowledged only in notes that read, "The boy must be cared for, but not exhibited"? How many forbidden rooms existed on the blueprints of other mansions, repurposed or relabeled as memories hardened into official histories? How many genealogies were massaged so that the published family tree matched the story the dynasty wanted told, not the one it actually lived? You start to see patterns in other collections: a shipping family with a missing branch in its printed lineage, and a suspiciously well-funded companion mentioned only in domestic account books. A railroad magnate whose estate ceded a modest but consistent income to a rural dependent, while his official biographers insisted he died with no surviving issue. Bank files where certain boxes, always identified by number, never by name, surface again and again in connection with specific surnames. These are not copies of the Livingston story, but variations on a theme: hidden heirs folded into trust language, silent witnesses scattered across documents, erased records sitting just beyond the edge of what commemorative books are willing to print. What the Livingston case gives us is not closure, but a vantage point. From here you can see how power in that era was not only about who owned what, but about who was allowed to exist on paper. The dark legacy of a family was not the scandal itself. It was the network of decisions required to keep it unofficial. Every erased initial had to be replaced by a euphemism. Every diverted inheritance required a phrase like "existing provision elsewhere." Every door that didn't appear on a blueprint needed a story to explain why that part of the corridor was never mentioned in tours. Memory was curated with the same care as investments, diversified across institutions, hedged against exposure. Eventually, though, the people who understood all the references, the attorneys who knew which events of '73 to avoid naming, the bankers who remembered what Box 47 really contained, the editors who could recall which heir never made it into print, left the stage. Some died, others retired, their offices closed, their filing systems were boxed up and shipped away. The stories they had been paid not to tell dissolved with them. What remained was the paperwork, stripped of its handlers, suddenly available to be read in ways no one had intended. That's the moment we've been walking through in this story. The slow transition from private crisis to public archive. When a dynasty's attempt to control its own narrative loses its caretakers and ends up in a catalog under a call number, the balance shifts. Not entirely. The family histories still sit on glossy shelves in museum bookstores. The portraits still hang intact in restored drawing rooms. The official genealogies still present an unbroken line. But now, in some quiet reading room, a researcher can lay those polished narratives beside the raw fragments and notice the mismatch. In the end, the distance between what the Livingstons claimed and what their papers reveal comes down to a simple image, a name that should have been printed and wasn't. The forgotten heir lives for us in the friction between a clean family tree and a crossed-out word in a proof, in the space between a carefully edited obituary and a ledger entry for special charges that never name their beneficiary. He exists in that narrow gap where official history and surviving evidence fail to line up. When the day's light started to thin and the reading room speaker reminded us that closing time was approaching, I gathered the documents back into their folders. The baptism copy slid against the trust schedule. The genealogical draft with its ghost of a penciled line nestled beside the clipping with the obliterated mention of an additional heir. Each piece disappeared into the neutral gray of archival cartons, the same color used for collections that have nothing to do with Golden Age secrets or hidden heirs. I wrote the reference number on a scrap of paper, the way researchers always do, knowing that tomorrow or next year someone else might request these same boxes for a completely different purpose. The carton closed with a muted thump, its metal edge catching the light for an instant before dulling again. From the outside, it looked like any other container in the room, one more anonymous block in a wall of silent witnesses. Only the small label on its spine distinguished it, a string of letters and numbers, nothing that would catch the eye of a casual visitor. I slid it onto the shelf where the archivist pointed, between collections whose stories I didn't know yet, and stepped back. Row after row of boxes stared back, identical, mute, waiting. Somewhere behind that neat facade, just out of sight, there is always one more name that didn't make it onto the official page. There is a moment, somewhere between the last page you read and the box you're about to close, when the Livingston file stops being just about them and starts being about us. Not us in the genealogical sense, but in the way we choose what deserves to be remembered. You sit at that table, surrounded by the quiet hum of the archive, and realize that what you've been following is not only the path of a hidden heir, but the outline of a culture that treated memory like property, owned, managed, edited. In the Gilded Age, mansions and endowments were one form of wealth. Control over the record was another. Hidden heirs, forbidden rooms, silent witnesses, each of them speaks less about a single family and more about a world that believed forgetting could be engineered as carefully as a railway line or a ballroom ceiling. Think about how much work went into making sure that boy remained an initial instead of a full name. A clerk had to hesitate before writing the surname. A lawyer had to choose peripheral obligation instead of son. A banker had to code his support as rural administration rather than inheritance. An editor had to draw a line, one single stroke of blue pencil, through the phrase, an additional heir to be presented. Dozens of hands, none of them wielding a gun or signing a death warrant, all participating in a softer kind of violence, the decision that a life could exist in reality but not on paper. That is the dark legacy the Livingston file reveals. Not just wealth built on labor or speculation, but reputations built on erased records and carefully curated silence. And then there is the other side of the ledger, the cost of being forgotten. Somewhere, beyond the ledgers and clippings, there was a person who grew up inside that omission. A child who lived on land technically not his, whose teachers wrote receipts with initials instead of names, whose existence depended on money that never called him rightful anything. The Golden Age secrets we uncover in archives often end at the paper trail, but the implications don't. When a dynasty decides that preserving its line is more important than recognizing its own blood, it is also deciding that some members of that line are acceptable as shadows, as long as they don't step into the light that shines on the official tree. This is where the Livingston file becomes a mirror. Because once you see the pattern here, hidden heirs pushed into the margins, forbidden rooms hiding strong boxes, silent witnesses scattered across institutions, you begin to notice how many other stories in this era rely on similar gaps. Why does this family Bible skip from one year to another without explanation? Why does that estate map show a cottage that never appears in published descriptions of the property? Why does a law firm's file index list issue of 1873 and then offer nothing else but a redacted memo and a trust schedule? The more you read, the clearer it becomes. What looks like accident or loss or the harmless chaos of time is often the residue of deliberate choices. The question for us, sitting in the reading room generations later, is uncomfortable. What do we do with a truth that survived only because the machinery of erasure was imperfect? The Gilded Age did everything it could to keep this story unofficial, yet here it is, pieced together from a baptism copy and a parish book, a land transfer that makes no economic sense, a half-erased line in a genealogical draft, a clipped sentence nearly scrubbed from a newspaper proof. We will never know every detail. We may never know the heir's full name with absolute certainty, never see his face in a portrait, never read his own words. What we have is a silhouette made of paper. Do we step back and say, it's too faint, it doesn't count? Or do we admit that faint is precisely how power wanted him to survive? It's tempting to imagine that this is all safely in the past, that they did this in some distant gilded age and we would never allow such erasure today. But the archive suggests something else. It hints that memory is always contested, that every era has its own version of hidden heirs, and erased records, even if the vocabulary has changed. Back then, the tools were ledgers, trusts, family Bibles, and newspaper editors. Now they might be databases, sealed files, non-disclosure agreements, and algorithms that let some stories vanish while amplifying others. The pattern remains. Some lives are framed and lit. Others are left just beyond the edge of the frame, visible only if you look deliberately into the dark. So the Livingston file becomes less a solved mystery and more a question held up to the light. Not just who was this child, but who gets to exist inside the official story. Who decides which branches of a family tree are worthy of ink and which are managed off the page? Who benefits from a clean narrative and who pays for its smoothness with their absence? These are not questions the documents can answer for you. They can only insist, quietly, that the neat stories we inherit about power and purity and order are rarely the whole truth. In the end, there's a small, almost unremarkable gesture that captures all of this. The researcher, any researcher, maybe you someday, finishes taking notes, copies down the call number, and begins to put the papers back into their folders. The erased initial disappears beneath the flap. The clipping with the scratched-out mention of an additional heir slides under a more official family record. The trust schedules with their ghostly references to special charges stack neatly, their edges aligned. The gray lid settles over the box with a soft, final sound. On the spine, only a code remains, a few letters, a date range, nothing glamorous enough to catch the eye on a tour. For a moment, the researcher's reflection appears faintly in the glass of the reading room door, superimposed over the rows of boxes, over the shelves of silent witnesses, over a world built to keep some stories bright and others permanently dim. The light shifts. The reflection fades. On the table, one document has been left. Out by mistake, a photocopy of that proof page where the words "an additional heir" were once printed and then crossed out. The blue line that erased them cuts across the paper like a thin, deliberate scar. The hand reaches back, hesitates over the page, and the camera holds there, on the scar, the empty space where a name should be, and the quiet knowledge that this small piece of dark legacy is now in the open, even if the world beyond that door still pretends the official tree was never cracked at all. In the end, the Livingston file does not close with a revelation, but with a gesture so ordinary it almost disappears. Cardboard against cardboard, a lid settling into place, the soft rasp of a box returning to its shelf. The ink does not change. The crossed-out name does not reappear. The child of 1873 is not suddenly restored to the family tree. Only the room grows quieter, and the distance between what was lived and what was allowed onto paper remains as wide as ever. The archive light dims to a pale rectangle on the table, then withdraws as the lamp is switched off. Somewhere far from this reading room, the ancestral house still stands, perhaps carefully restored as a museum, perhaps still inhabited as a private residence. Visitors walk polished corridors, pause before portraits, listen to guides speak of lineage, philanthropy, public virtue. They may hear of railway ventures, art collections, charitable endowments. They will almost certainly never hear of the boy whose existence was folded into margins and trust schedules, then pressed flat beneath a dynasty's need for order. Yet the silence is no longer complete. A reference number now exists where there was once only an instruction to forget. A trail now runs, however faintly, from a parish book to a land transfer, from a banker's ledger to a proof page where the words, "an additional heir," were struck through with a single, decisive line. Closing the box does not close that question. It only, returns it to the shadows where so much of the Gilded Age preferred to work. In this light, the Livingston Dynasty is less an exception than a lens. Through it, we see how families of that era did not merely acquire estates and capitals. They governed the frontier between memory and oblivion. Hidden heirs, forbidden rooms, silent witnesses, erased records. These are not stray curiosities, but the tools of a culture that understood forgetting as an act of power. What survives in the archive is only what escaped the fire, the furnace, the editor's pencil, the lawyer's last revision. So as the box returns to its place among 100 others, the story does not resolve. It simply waits. Another researcher will come, perhaps with different questions, perhaps chasing a different name that fell from the official page. Each pair of eyes will read the same documents and see new angles in the shadows. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. In Heir, a world built on controlled narratives, interpretation itself becomes a quiet form of resistance. If this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. And if you wish to keep walking beside us through these rooms, through the dust, the ledgers, the portraits that do not match their own papers, stay close, so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. Beyond the Golden Halls exists for precisely this: to follow the lines others tried to erase, to listen again to the silent witnesses preserved in boxes no one expected to be reopened. Out there, more mansions stand against the skyline, their facades restored, their histories polished to a reassuring sheen. In here, more cartons sit under neutral light, holding dark legacy in the form of baptisms half erased, land quietly diverted, faces missing from family trees. And if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. What we have seen in the Livingston file is only one corridor in a much larger architecture of forgetting, a single door among many that were locked in the belief that no one would ever turn the key again. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth. The question that remains, as the room empties and the shelves recede into darkness, is how many more names lie crossed out in the quiet, waiting for someone patient enough to read what the ink no longer dares to say.